There are those rare movies that are just consistently brilliant or relentlessly terrible from start to finish, but most films fall somewhere in between. It's also uncommon that a single scene is so unconscionably unbearable as to sink an entire movie. And yet, as evidenced by this list, it absolutely happens. So with that in mind, I'm Ellie with What Culture here with 10 horror movies ruined entirely by one scene. Number 10. Do You Think, Cuz? Texas Chainsaw 3D. Texas Chainsaw 3D admittedly isn't a particularly good movie at even the best of times, but there's a single moment which sees it metamorphose from merely watchable trash to downright unbearable. The film makes the bold, if perhaps misguided decision to try and reinvent Leatherface as an iconic anti-hero, ultimately teaming him with protagonist Heather, who is revealed to be his cousin. In the finale, Heather sides with Leatherface over the town's corrupt cops, and when confronting Mayor Bert Hartman, decides to throw Leatherface's chainsaw to her deranged cousin before telling him, "Do you think, cuz?" Now, to be fair, even Daniel Day-Lewis himself couldn't make that atrocious line sound good. And it marks the point at which it was clear that the creatives in charge had no earthly idea what fans of the franchise actually wanted out of these movies. The film's dialogue was never going to win awards, but come on, this line is something else, really it is. That it made it past the scripting, shooting, and editing stages of production to be witnessed by millions of embarrassed viewers is staggering. Number 9. The Spielberg Ending, Paranormal Activity. Though Steven Spielberg was instrumental in found footage film Paranormal Activity getting picked up by Paramount and enjoying a hugely successful theatrical box office run, Spielberg's involvement did also have a compromising effect on the end product. The Oscar-winning filmmaker felt that the original finale didn't offer a big enough payoff, and so at the director's behest, a new ending was shot where a possessed Katie kills her partner and throws his corpse towards the camera before Katie's face morphs demonically and the film suddenly cuts to black. It was a corny, generic sequel bait ending complete with some truly woeful CGI for Katie's face morph, and proved infinitely inferior to the original ending, which ended the film with the police entering the house and discovering Katie with a bloody knife. At that moment, Katie would return to her regular self, but just as she approaches the police, the demon would slam the attic door, startling one of the cops and causing him to accidentally shoot Katie dead. That's a far more jolting and effective ending, and would have ensured that Paranormal Activity's legacy endured as a fascinating one-off rather than a franchise that very quickly ran itself into the ground. Number 8. Red Explains Everything, Us. Jordan Peele's Us was a solidly compelling follow-up to his Oscar-winning filmmaking debut Get Out, at least until it came time to wrap things up. In the third act, Peele goes way too far in explaining the phenomenon of the tethered, the terrifying doppelgangers who have emerged to violently untether themselves from their regular counterparts. The main tethered, Red, reveals to her counterpart, Adelaide, that the tethered reside underground and are the result of a government experiment to control their equivalent above ground. The government eventually abandoned their experiment, leaving the tethered to roam around underground, mimicking their doubles above ground and subsisting on rabbit meat. This is a classic case of a movie over-explaining itself unnecessarily. This reveal invites a ton of questions, namely, how exactly can all the tethered fit underground? How do they mimic precisely what their doubles are doing? And how can they survive on something as lean as rabbit meat? Basically, Peele literalized a story that didn't need to be. Trying to cram something otherworldly into a realistic box rarely works, and this is proof perfect of why. It forces the audience to confront and scrutinize in logical terms rather than just accept the unknown. Number 7. The Reveal, Man vs. For the vast majority of its runtime, Man vs. is a solid little horror flick in which a celebrity survivalist, Doug, is terrorized by something in the remote Ontario wilderness. Yet, as it turns out, nothing in this movie proves scarier than the shockingly subpar VFX used to realize the creature when the time comes for the big third act reveal. The alien entity, which has been stalking Doug for the entire movie, is eventually revealed to be a Poundland predator, a shockingly naff-looking extraterrestrial rendered with CGI that would scarcely pass muster in 1995, let alone 2015. Even accepting that Man vs. clearly wasn't made for a pretty penny, VFX was absolutely the wrong route here, and the filmmakers would have been better served by opting for the old man-in-suit gambit instead. It's a damn shame, as this is a tight, well-executed survival horror flick up to that point, after which it becomes impossible to take seriously. Number 6. Freddy Gets Called to the F-Word, Freddy vs. Jason. This otherwise solidly entertaining, fan-serving grudge match between two of the genre's most iconic heroes is stopped dead in its tracks when one of Freddy Krueger's intended victims, Kia, asks him what kind of F-word runs around in a Christmas sweater. Beyond being completely out of place in the scene, it doesn't exactly encourage the audience to root for Kia's survival by having her drop a random homophobic slur totally out of nowhere. Even back in 2003, it was surprising to hear Kia's outburst, and 2 decades later, it makes the film seem horrendously dated. Since then, the screenwriters have confirmed that they didn't write the line, insisting that it was added at some point during production, and they even complained about it after hearing it at a test screening. Well, their feedback was evidently ignored, and they view the scene as a real stain on the movie. And they're not wrong. Number 5. The Ghost Kids, Sinister. Sinister is one hell of a creepy movie that gets a lot right, especially with its climactic reveal that the protagonist, Ellison Oswalt, inadvertently marked himself and his family for death by doing the very thing we always want folks to do in haunted house movies: leave the damn house. It's a clever subversion of expectations, but less smart is the additional reveal that the missing children from each of the Babylonian gods' murder scenes have become accomplices under his influence. The whole spooky children trope has been grossly overdone in horror for literally decades at this point, and so seeing Ellison be terrorized by these ash-faced kids in his house is ultimately just a bit laughable. Number 4. The Motaro Roar, The Babadook. Much as Jennifer Kent's chilling meditation on grief, parenting, and yes, trauma was raved about by critics, Kent and her team made one fatal misstep. They didn't create bespoke sound effects for the titular monster, but instead relied upon existing sounds. Near the end of the movie, when we hear the Babadook roar, the sound is borrowed from Mortal Kombat 3, where the exact same distinctive roar is used for the half-man, half-stallion Motaro. For anyone familiar with the game, it's incredibly distracting to hear such a memorable sound effect recycled in a totally dead serious horror movie. More to the point, where horror movie villains are concerned, it's incredibly risky to use pre-existing sounds rather than having the sound team create a unique sonic signature for the character. For all of the film's terrific craft, otherwise, the pivotal climax falters because of one sound design choice. Yikes. Number 3. Say Hi to Mummy, In Hell, Friday the 13th. 2009's Friday the 13th reimagining is pretty good for the most part, no matter that its final girl, Whitney Miller, is one of the dullest and least interesting in the entire franchise. And it certainly didn't endear fans to Whitney that her climactic line while stabbing Jason with a machete is the toe-curling cringeworthy, "Say hi to mommy, in hell." It's a solid contender for one of the worst lines in the entire Friday the 13th franchise, and sticks out like a sore thumb in a movie that's otherwise relatively serious, at least for the series standards anyway. There are many scenes where the movie could have got away with a dodgy line like this, but during Jason's big death scene, not a chance. Number 2, sponsored by Pepsi, World War Z. World War Z isn't a great movie by any means, but considering its well-documented post-production woes, the fact that it's a perfectly watchable horror actioner is pretty impressive. And not even a PG-13 rating nor that laughable scene where a doctor trips and shoots himself in the head could entirely derail this so-so adaptation of Max Brooks' beloved horror novel. Instead, it comes down to one unintentionally hilarious aside at the very end of the movie, when protagonist Jerry Lane heads to the World Health Organization facility in Cardiff and tests out a pathogen which he believes can camouflage him from the zombies. After injecting himself, Jerry stops at a Pepsi vending machine and treats himself to a cold can of the fizzy stuff. A seemingly triumphant moment of respite for the man before he releases all the cans from the machine in order to draw the zombies' attention and test out the camo. Yet everything about this moment is impossible to take seriously, given that it's basically shot like a damn Pepsi commercial, reminding you that you're watching a soulless corporate product rather than, well, an earnest attempt at adapting Brooks' novel into a movie. The Pepsi cans all carefully angled towards the camera, Brad Pitt seemingly having the time of his life as he chugs it down. It's distracting to the point of lunacy, and all the more ridiculous when you consider that this was a reshoot. Does anyone else want Pepsi now? Before we move on to number 1, if you haven't yet seen The Exorcist Believer, there are major spoilers ahead. Number 1, Chris Gets Blinded, The Exorcist Believer. Continuing Hollywood's baffling legacy sequel trend of dusting off popular franchise characters only to show fans how miserable their lives now are, the new Exorcist film brings Chris McNeil back into the fold for an absolutely hateful cameo. Protagonist Victor seeks Chris's help in dealing with the possession of both his own daughter, Angela, and Angela's friend, Catherine. This leads to Chris performing a deliverance ritual on Catherine, resulting in Catherine stabbing Chris's eyes out with a cross, blinding her. Trotting 90-year-old Ellen Burstyn out for a thankless 10-minute cameo before brutally wounding her character and putting her back on the bench for most of the rest of the movie is, well, it's a choice. Fans could have abided many of the film's other bizarre creative decisions, but bringing Chris back only to inflict such a horrific fate upon her just felt like cruelty for cruelty's sake. And remember, this is supposedly the start of a trilogy. Oh dear. And that concludes our list. Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below, and while you're there, don't forget to like and subscribe and tap that notification bell. Also head over to Twitter and follow us there, and I can be found across various social medias just by searching Ellie Littlechild. I've been Ellie with What Culture. I hope you have a magical day, and I'll see you real soon.